next time. Bye.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Subtitles made by the Amara.org community.
Today I'm here to tell you that the West is in danger. It is in danger because those who are supposed to defend the values of the West, it is swatted by a worldview that inevitably leads to socialism and consequently to poverty. Unfortunately, in recent decades, motivated by some thoughtful desires to want to help others, and some by the desire to belong to a privileged caste, the main leaders of the Western world have abandoned the freedom model for various versions of what we call collectivism. We are here to tell you that the collectivist experiments, they are never the solution to the problems that afflict the world's citizens, but on the contrary, they are the cause. Believe me, no one better than us Argentines to attest to these two issues. When we adopted the model of freedom back in 1860, in 35 years, we became the world's leading power. While when we embrace collectivism, over the last 100 years, we've seen how our citizens have systematically begun to impoverish
at number 140 in the world.
To be able to give a discussion, it's important that we first look at the data that supports why free enterprise capitalism is not only a possible system to end world poverty, but it is the only morally desirable system to achieve it. If we consider the history of economic progress, we can see how from the year zero to around 1800, the world's per capita GDP remained virtually constant throughout the reference period.
If one looks
A
at
chart of the evolution of economic growth throughout human history would look like a hockey stick, an exponential function that remained constant for 90% of the time and shoots up exponentially from the 19th century. The only exception to this stagnation story occurred at the end of the 15th century with the discovery of America. But with this exception, throughout the whole period between the year zero and the year 1800, the GDP was
per capita globally remained stagnant.
Now, well, not only did capitalism create a wealth explosion
from the moment it was adopted
as an economic system, but if one looks at the data, what is observed is that the growth has been accelerating throughout the period.
Between September and July
1800, the growth rate of per capita GDP remained stable at around 0.02% per year, which means practically no growth. From the 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution, the growth rate increased to 0.66%. At that rate, growth would be needed to double the GDP per capita for 107 years. Well, if we look at the period between 1900 and 1950, the growth rate accelerates to 1.36% per year. We no longer need 107 years to double the GDP per capita, but 66. And if we look at the period between 1950 and the year 2000, we see that the growth rate was 2.1% per year. This would mean that in just 33 years, we could double the world's GDP per capita. This trend, far from stopping, is still alive today. If we take the period between the year 2000 and 2023, the growth rate accelerated again by 3% annually, which implies that we could double our GDP per capita in the world in just 23 years. Here it comes. When studying the per capita GDP from the year 1800 to the present day, what we observe is that after the Industrial Revolution, the world GDP per capita multiplied by more than 15 times, generating a wealth explosion that took 90% of the world's population out of poverty. We must never forget that for the year 1800, about 95% of the world population lived in extreme poverty, whereas that number fell to 5% for the year 2020, prior to the pandemic.
Thank you.
Being the cause of our problems, free enterprise capitalism as an economic system is the only tool we have to end hunger and poverty. Poverty all over the planet. The empirical evidence is unquestionable.
So as not
Is there any doubt that free market capitalism is superior in productive terms? The left-wing doctrine has attacked capitalism for its moral issues. To be, according to them, its detractors say it is unfair. They say that capitalism is bad because it is individualistic, and that collectivism is good because it is altruistic. They struggle for social justice with others' concerns. But this concept, which has become fashionable in the first world recently, has been a constant in the political discourse of my country for more than 80 years. The issue is that social justice is not fair. It doesn't contribute to the general welfare either. Far from it, it's an inherently unfair idea because it's violent too. It's unfair because the state is funded through taxes, and taxes are collected coercively. Or can any of us say that we pay taxes voluntarily? This means that the state finances itself through coercion, and that the higher the tax burden, the greater the coercion, the less the freedom. Those who promote social justice start from the idea that the overall economy is a cake that can be divided in a different way. But that pie isn't given. It's wealth that is generated in what, for instance, Israel Kirchner calls a market discovery process. If the good or service a company offers is not desired, that company goes bankrupt unless it adapts to what the market is demanding. If you produce a good quality product at a good price that's attractive, you will do well and produce more. So the market is a discovery process in which the capitalists find the correct direction on the go. But if the state punishes the capitalist for succeeding and blocks him in this discovery process, it destroys his incentives, and the consequences of that are going to produce less, and the pie will be smaller, causing harm to society as a whole. Collectivism, by inhibiting these discovery processes and making the appropriation of what is discovered difficult, it ties the hands of the entrepreneur and makes it impossible to produce better goods and offer better services at a better price. How can it then be that from academia, international organizations, politics, and economic theory, an economic system is demonized, which has not only lifted 90% of the world's population out of extreme poverty, and it does it faster and faster. Besides, it is fair and morally superior. Thanks to free enterprise capitalism, the world is at its best today. There has never been a moment of greater prosperity in all of human history than the one we live today. Today's world is freer, richer, more peaceful, and more prosperous than at any other time. This is true for everyone, but particularly for those countries that are free, where they respect economic freedom and individual property rights. Because those countries that are free are 12 times richer than the oppressed ones. The lowest in the distribution of free countries live better than 90% of the population of repressed countries. It has 25 times fewer poor people in the standard format and 50 times fewer in the extreme format. And if that wasn't enough, citizens in free countries live 25% longer than citizens in oppressed countries. Now, to understand what we come to defend is important to define. From here, when we talk about libertarianism. To define it, I go back to the words of the greatest hero of the ideas of freedom from Argentina, Professor Alberto Venega Lynch, who says, libertarianism is the unrestricted respect for the life project of others based on the principle of non-aggression and in defense of the right to life, liberty, and property, whose fundamental institutions are the property of democracy,
Private life,
free markets without state intervention, free competition, division of labor, and social cooperation, where you can only be successful by serving others with better quality goods at a better price. Said in another way, the capitalist, the successful entrepreneur, is a social benefactor who, far from appropriating others' wealth, contributes to general welfare. In short, a successful entrepreneur is a hero. This is the model we are proposing for the future of Argentina, a model based on the fundamental principles of libertarianism, the defense of life, liberty, and property. Well now, if free enterprise capitalism and economic freedom have been extraordinary tools to end poverty in the world, and today we find ourselves in the best moment of human history. It's worth asking why I say then that the West is in danger. I say that the West is in danger precisely because in those countries where we should defend the values of the free market, private property, and other institutions of libertarianism, sectors of the political and economic establishment, some due to errors in their theoretical framework, and others out of power ambition are undermining the foundations of libertarianism, opening the doors to socialism, and potentially condemning us to poverty, misery, and stagnation. Because one should never forget that socialism is always and everywhere an impoverishing phenomenon, which failed in all the countries where it was tried. It was a failure economically, it was a social failure, it was a cultural failure, and it also killed more than 100 million human beings. The essential problem of the West today is that we not only have to face those who, even after the fall of the wall and the overwhelming empirical evidence, it continues to be intoxicated by impoverishing socialism, but also to our own leaders, thinkers, and academics who have stopped in a wrong theoretical framework. They are undermining the foundations of the system that has given us the greatest expansion of wealth and prosperity in our history. The theoretical framework I am referring to is that of neoclassical economic theory. They design a tool that unintentionally ends up serving the state's interference, socialism, and the degradation of society. The problem with neoclassicals is that, like the model they fell in love with does not mop against reality. They attribute the error to the supposed market failure instead of reviewing the premises of their model. Regulations are introduced based on the text of a supposed market failure, which only generate distortions in the price system that prevent economic calculation and consequently saving, investment, and growth. This problem essentially lies in the fact that not even supposedly libertarian economists understand what the market is. In other words, if it was understood, it would quickly become evident that something like a market failure is impossible. The market is not just a graphic description of a supply curve and another demand curve on a chart. The market is a mechanism for social cooperation where property rights are voluntarily exchanged. Therefore, given this definition, talking about market failure is an oxymoron. There is no such thing as market failure. If transactions are voluntary, the only context in which there can be a market failure is if there is coercion. And the only one with the ability to coerce in a generalized way is the state, which has the monopoly of violence. Therefore, if someone believes there is a market failure, I would recommend them to check if there is state intervention in the environment. And if you find no state intervention at all, I suggest you redo the analysis because it's definitely wrong. Market failures don't exist. An example of the supposed market failures that neoclassical economists describe are the concentrated structures of the economy. However, without functions presenting increasing returns to scale, whose counterpart are the concentrated structures of the economy, we could not explain economic growth from 1800 to today. Look how interesting. From 1800 onwards, with the population multiplying more than 8 or 9 times, per capita product grew more than 15 times. That is, there are increasing returns. This brought extreme poverty from 95% to 5%. However, these presences of increasing yields imply concentrated structures, what would be called, for instance, a monopoly. How can it be that something that has generated so much well-being, for the neoclassical theory, that's a market failure? Neoclassical economists get out from the box. When the model fails, one should not get angry at reality, one should get angry at the model and change it. The dilemma faced by the neoclassical model is that they claim to want to perfect the market operation by attacking what they consider failures. But in doing so, They not only open the doors of socialism, but also threaten economic growth. For example, to regulate monopolies, to destroy their profits, and to smash the yields.
Increasingly in mind from economic growth.
In other words, every time you want to correct a supposed market failure, you inevitably do so without knowing what the market is. Or for having fallen in love with a flawed model, they are opening the doors to socialism. And you are condemning people to poverty. However, in the face of the theoretical demonstration that state intervention is harmful, the empirical evidence that it failed because it could not be otherwise. The solution that the collectivists will propose is not more freedom, but it is more regulation, generating a downward spiral of regulations until we are all poorer and everyone's life depends on a bureaucrat sitting in a luxury office. Given the resounding failure of collectivist models and the undeniable advances of the free world, socialists were forced to change their agenda. They left behind the class struggle based on the economic system to replace it with another. Supposed social conflicts are just as harmful to community life and economic growth. The first of these new battles was the ridiculous and unnatural fight between man and woman. Libertarianism already establishes equality between the sexes. The cornerstone of our creed states that all men are created equal, that we all have the same inalienable rights granted by the Creator, among which are life, liberty, and property. The only thing this radical feminism agenda has become is more state intervention to hinder the economic process, giving work to bureaucrats who contributed nothing to society, be it in the form of women's ministries. International organizations dedicated to promoting this agenda. Another conflict that socialists pose is men versus nature, that human beings damage the planet and that it must be protected at all costs. Even advocating for population control mechanisms in the bloody abortion agenda. Unfortunately, these harmful ideas have strongly permeated our society. The neo-Marxists have managed to co-opt the common sense of the West. They achieved this thanks to the appropriation of the media, culture, universities, and and also from international organizations. This last case is perhaps the most serious because these are institutions that have a huge influence on the political and economic decisions of the countries that make up these multilateral organizations. Luckily, we are increasingly more of us who dare to raise our voice because we see that if we don't directly combat these ideas, the only possible outcome is that every time we are going to have more state, more regulation, more socialism, more poverty, less freedom, and in consequence, worse standard of living. It has already started to go down this path. I know that to many it may sound ridiculous to suggest that the West
has become
dedicated to socialism, but it's only ridiculous to the extent that one restricts oneself to the traditional economic definition of socialism, which states that it's an economic system where the state owns the means of production. Definition should be, from my point of view, updated to the current circumstances. Today, states don't need to directly control the means of production to control every aspect of individuals' lives. With tools like monetary emission indebtedness, subsidies, interest rate control, price controls, and regulations to correct supposed market failures, they can control the destinies of millions of human beings. This is how we got to the point where, under different names or forms, a good part of the generally accepted political offers in most Western countries, they are collectivist variants. In other words, whether they are openly declared or not. Communists, fascists, Nazis, socialists, social democrats, national socialists, Christian Democrats, Keynesians, neo-Keynesians, progressives, populists, nationalists, or globalists. At the end of the day, there are no substantive differences. Everyone maintains that the state should direct all aspects of individuals' lives. All of them define a model contrary to the one that led humanity to the most spectacular progress in its history. We come here today to invite other Western countries to resume the path of prosperity, economic freedom, limited government, and unrestricted respect for private property are essential elements for economic growth. This phenomenon of impoverishment that collectivism produces is not a fantasy, nor is it fatalism. It's a reality that we Argentinians have known very well for at least 100 years, because we've been through this, we've already experienced this, because, as I said before, since we decided to abandon the freedom model that made us rich, we are trapped in a downward spiral where we become poorer every day. That is, we have already experienced it, and we're here to alert you about what can happen if Western countries which got rich on the model of freedom, they continue on this path of servitude. The Argentine case is empirical evidence that it doesn't matter how rich you are, no matter how many natural resources you have, it doesn't matter how skilled the population is, how educated it is, or how many gold bars there are in the central bank's vaults. If measures are adopted that hinder the free functioning of the markets, free competition, free price systems, if trade is hindered, if private property is infringed upon, the only possible destination is poverty. Therefore, to conclude, I want to send a message to all the businessmen here and those who are not but are following us from everywhere on the planet. Do not be intimidated either by the political caste or by the parasites that live off the state. Do not surrender to a political class that only wants to perpetuate itself in power and maintain its privileges. You are social benefactors, you are heroes, you are the creators of a period of prosperity, more extraordinary than we have ever lived. Let no one tell you that your ambition is immoral. If you're making money, it is because you offer a better product, a better price, thereby contributing to general welfare. They don't give in to state advancement. The state is not the solution, the state is the problem itself. You are the real protagonists of this story, and know that from today you have Argentina as an unconditional ally. Thank you very much, and long live freedom, damit.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
That's fine.